Sometimes the greatest battles we fight are against the monsters we've become. Every parent knows the weight of promises made in desperation, and every child knows the price of their father's choices. When Vampire Lord Alaric returns to collect on a 30-year-old debt, he expects gold or cattle from the man whose wife he once saved. Instead, he finds only a broken widower and his deaf daughter, Elenna. She speaks through carved symbols and gentle hands, unafraid of the creature that has haunted her village's nightmares. What should be a simple collection becomes complicated when her silent presence awakens something Alaric thought had died centuries ago. In taking her to settle the debt, he discovers that some debts can only be repaid with the heart. What happens when a monster finds his humanity through the eyes of someone who sees the world differently? Before we continue with this story of unexpected grace, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The village of Thornwick had learned to live with shadows long before Alaric's name became legend. Nestled in a valley where ancient oaks stretched gnarled fingers toward a sky that seemed perpetually grey, it was the kind of place where stories passed down through generations carried more weight than any written law. The wind never stopped here, whistling through the gaps between weathered stone cottages and rattling the wooden shutters that villagers kept tightly closed after sunset. Thomas Brennan had lived in the same cottage for 43 years, watching the seasons change the landscape while his own face grew lined with worry and age. The small dwelling sat at the village's edge, close enough to hear the church bell on Sundays, but far enough from the market square to avoid the bustle that came with neighbors who asked too many questions. His hands, once strong enough to work the lumber mills, now trembled slightly as they carved delicate patterns into pieces of soft pine, a skill he'd passed to his daughter along with his stubborn streak and gentle heart. Elenna moved through their modest home with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate a world without sound. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from within, expressive brown eyes that seemed to hold entire conversations, long chestnut hair that caught what little sunlight filtered through their small windows, and hands that spoke a language more eloquent than most people managed with their voices. Her wooden message boards, each one carved with intricate symbols and flowing script, hung throughout the cottage like pages from a book only she and her father could read fluently. The morning routine never varied. Thomas would rise before dawn, light the fire, and prepare their simple breakfast of porridge and whatever fruit they could afford from the village market. Elenna would emerge from her small room, carrying the message board she'd prepared the night before, usually containing observations about the weather, plans for the day, or gentle reminders about tasks that needed attention. Their communication flowed with the ease of people who had spent decades learning to truly listen to each other. The Hartwell family's roof needs mending before the next storm. Elenna's carved message read that particular morning, her fingers tracing the words as her father read them aloud, a habit that helped him feel connected to her thoughts. Young Ben mentioned it yesterday when he delivered the milk. His grandmother worries about the winter. Thomas nodded, already calculating whether they had enough spare wood and if his aging joints could handle another roofing project. Work had become scarce, as younger, stronger men took over the village's manual labor, leaving him to survive on the occasional repair job and the vegetables they managed to grow in their small garden. The truth was, they were barely scraping by, and both father and daughter knew it, though neither spoke of it directly. The cottage itself told their story through its worn but lovingly maintained details. Elenna's carvings decorated nearly every wooden surface, not from vanity, but from necessity. Beautiful spiraling patterns marked the locations of important household items. Delicate flowers indicated which herbs grew in which section of their garden. Tiny symbols showed the safest paths through the village for someone who couldn't hear approaching carts or horses. What others might have seen as simple decoration was actually an intricate system that allowed Elenna to move through her world with confidence and independence. Their wooden message boards represented the heart of their relationship. Thomas had crafted the first one when Elenna was barely 5 years old, after they realized that her hearing loss was complete and permanent. Over the years, they had developed their own written language, part traditional letters, part carved symbols, part artistic expression that captured emotions and concepts that regular words couldn't convey. The boards themselves were works of art, smooth birchwood polished to a honey gold finish that gleamed in the lamplight. The villagers had learned to accept Elenna's difference, though their understanding remained limited. Some crossed themselves when they saw her signing to her father, convinced that her hand movements held some mystical power. Others pitied Thomas for having a daughter who couldn't hear the church bells or sing along with harvest songs. Few recognized the remarkable intelligence that shone in her eyes, or noticed how her careful observations often revealed truths that escaped those who relied only on their ears. Mrs. Hartwell, the village baker, was among the kinder souls. She had learned a handful of Elenna's symbols and always saved them the day-old bread, refusing payment with a wave of her flour-dusted hand. "That girl sees things the rest of us miss," she would tell anyone who listened. "Mark my words, there's something special about her." The village priest, Father Benedict, maintained a cautious distance. He'd never openly declared Elenna's condition a curse, but neither had he embraced her as fully as he might have. His sermons occasionally touched on themes of divine trials and testing, delivered with glances toward the back pew where Thomas and Elenna sat together, holding their silence like a shared prayer. But it was the older villagers who carried the weight of memory, who remembered the night 30 years ago when Thomas had disappeared into the forest with terror in his eyes and returned before dawn with relief and something else, something that looked like shame. They remembered how his wife Sarah had been dying in childbirth, how the midwife had shaken her head and begun preparing the family for loss, and how Thomas had suddenly announced he would find another way. The forest beyond Thornwick held secrets older than the village itself. Ancient trees grew so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground beneath their canopy, creating a perpetual twilight that discouraged casual exploration. Local folklore spoke of creatures that moved between the shadows, of bargains struck in desperate moments, and of a presence that watched the village from somewhere deep within those woods. Sarah Brennan had labored for 2 days, her strength ebbing with each hour that passed. The baby Elenna seemed determined to enter the world, but complications arose that were beyond the midwife's skills. In those days, the nearest doctor lived 2 days' journey away, and winter storms had made the roads impassable. As Sarah's breathing grew shallow and her pulse weakened, Thomas faced a choice that no man should have to make. The villagers still whispered about what happened next, though none claimed to know the full truth. Thomas had kissed his unconscious wife's forehead, spoken briefly with the midwife, and walked into the storm wearing nothing but his shirt and thin coat. He carried no lantern, no weapon, no supplies, just the desperate determination of a man with nothing left to lose. Where he went that night remained a mystery that Thomas never fully explained. He returned as the first pale light of dawn touched the village, soaked to the bone, and speaking in quiet, urgent tones with the midwife. Within an hour, Sarah's breathing had steadied. By evening, Elenna had been born healthy and whole, though the midwife noted that the child's ears seemed malformed, tiny, and sealed in a way that would leave her forever deaf. Sarah lived for another 6 months, long enough to hold her daughter and teach her husband the basics of caring for an infant. Long enough to see Elenna's bright, alert eyes and to understand that her child would face the world differently but not diminished. When Sarah finally passed, it was peacefully, in her sleep, with Thomas holding her hand and Elenna sleeping in the cradle he had carved with his own hands. The years that followed were a study in adaptation and love. Thomas learned to communicate with his daughter through touch and expression before either of them understood that she couldn't hear. He discovered that she watched faces with unusual intensity, reading emotions and intentions with startling accuracy. When she began to show interest in his woodworking tools, he guided her small hands in creating her first simple carvings, a flower, a bird, a heart that she pressed against his chest to show her love. As Elenna grew, so did her unique way of seeing the world. She noticed details that others missed, the way shadows shifted before storms arrived, how different people walked when they carried secrets, the subtle changes in her father's expression that told her when money was running short or when his arthritis was causing him pain. Her wooden message boards evolved from simple communication tools into complex works of art that captured not just words, but emotions, memories, and dreams. Now, at 28, Elenna had become an integral part of the village's quiet rhythm. She helped with harvests, using her careful attention to detail to spot the finest produce. She assisted the midwife with births, her calm presence and gentle hands providing comfort to laboring mothers. Her carvings had begun to find their way into village homes as gifts and decorations, each one carrying a little piece of the peace that seemed to surround her. Thomas watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and worry that had deepened with each passing year. The debt he had incurred 30 years ago remained unspoken between them, but it lived in his chest like a cold stone, growing heavier as he aged, and Elenna's independence grew. He had made a bargain in desperation, trading future payment for present salvation, and the terms had been clear, even if the timeline remained uncertain. The cottage they shared bore witness to their lives together, walls marked with Elenna's growing artistic skill, furniture worn smooth by daily use, windows that looked out toward the forest, where Thomas's eyes sometimes lingered with an expression his daughter couldn't quite interpret. The wooden message boards that filled their home told the story of their relationship through carved symbols and gentle words, a private language built on love and necessity. As autumn deepened and the wind began to carry the sharp promise of winter, Thomas found himself looking toward the forest more often, as if he could sense something stirring in the shadows between the trees. Elenna noticed his distraction, but when she carved questions about his worry, he would only smile and deflect her attention to practical matters: firewood to gather, preserves to prepare, repairs to complete before the cold settled in for good. Neither of them could have known that 30 years of borrowed time was about to come due, or that the debt Thomas had incurred in his moment of desperate love would soon transform all their lives in ways neither could imagine. The morning routine continued unchanged, but somewhere in the ancient forest, something old and patient was finally stirring, ready to collect what had been promised long ago. The village of Thornwick slept peacefully, unaware that its quiet days of familiar rhythm were numbered, and that soon the shadows would step forward to claim what had always belonged to them. The autumn evening carried an unusual stillness, as if the wind itself had paused to listen for something approaching through the forest. Thomas felt at first a prickling along his spine that made him set down his carving knife and look up from the small wooden bird he'd been shaping for the pastor's granddaughter. Elenna noticed his sudden tension immediately, her eyes following his gaze toward the window where the last pale light of day was fading into purple dusk. She reached for her message board, but before she could carve a question, the temperature in their cottage seemed to drop 10 degrees. The fire in their modest hearth flickered despite the absence of any wind, and somewhere in the distance, a sound that was not quite footsteps began approaching their door. Thomas rose slowly, his joints protesting after hours of detailed work, and moved toward the window with the careful steps of a man who had been expecting this moment for 30 years. The figure that emerged from the tree line moved with predatory grace, neither hurrying nor hesitating as it crossed the open ground between forest and cottage. Even in the dim light, Thomas could make out the tall, lean silhouette, the pale skin that seemed to catch what little moonlight filtered through the clouds, and the dark coat that billowed around the visitor like wings. Alaric had changed little in 3 decades. Vampires, Thomas remembered with a chill, were not subject to the same aging that marked mortal lives. Elenna rose from her chair, message board in hand, but her father gestured for her to stay back. His movements carried a weight of resignation that she had never seen before, and when he looked at her, his expression held an apology that made her heart race with sudden fear. Whatever was approaching their door was connected to secrets her father had carried alone. The knock, when it came, was neither urgent nor timid. 3 deliberate raps that seemed to echo through the cottage with unnatural resonance. Thomas straightened his shoulders, whispered something that looked like a prayer, and walked to the door with the measured steps of a condemned man approaching the gallows. Alaric stood on their threshold like a figure, stepped out of a nightmare made elegant. His dark hair showed no trace of grey, his pale blue eyes held the cold beauty of winter moonlight, and his presence seemed to draw warmth from the very air around him. He wore clothes that had once been fine, a long black coat with silver buttons, dark trousers, and boots that had walked countless miles without showing wear. Everything about him suggested wealth and power held in careful restraint. Thomas Brennan. The vampire's voice carried the refined accent of aristocracy mixed with something older and more dangerous. "You look well for a man who owes me 30 years of interest." From behind her father, Elenna watched the stranger with the keen attention she applied to everything in her silent world. She could see the tension in her father's shoulders, the way his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe, but she could also see something unexpected in the visitor's expression, a flicker of surprise as his gaze moved past Thomas to settle on her. "Alaric." Thomas's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "I had hoped that I had forgotten, that death might have claimed me in your absence." Alaric stepped across the threshold without invitation, moving with fluid grace into their modest home. "I am patient, Thomas, but I am not mortal. Debts do not disappear simply because we wish them to." Elenna found herself studying the intruder with unusual boldness. Where others might have seen only a creature of nightmares, she noticed details that spoke to her artistic eye. The careful way he moved to avoid their simple furniture, the brief softening of his expression when his gaze fell on her father's wood carvings, the almost imperceptible pause when he noticed the message boards hanging on their walls. "I brought the ledger," Alaric continued, producing a leather-bound book that seemed far older than it should be. The ancient volume fell open in his hands to a page covered with entries written in various hands across what looked like centuries. "Your name appears here, along with the terms we agreed upon. 1 life saved, payment to be collected at my discretion." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they held the pain of a man facing the consequences of an impossible choice. "Sarah lived for 6 months after Elenna's birth. She saw our daughter smile, heard her first sounds. For that gift, I would make the same bargain again. And I honored my part completely." Alaric's tone carried no malice, only the weight of absolute certainty. "Your wife lived, your child was born healthy, and you were granted 30 years of happiness with both. Now the debt must be settled." Elenna stepped forward, her message board held carefully in both hands. She had been watching the exchange with growing understanding, reading the truth in her father's posture and the stranger's words. With quick, sure strokes, she carved a simple question and held it up for both men to see. "What do you want from us?" Alaric's attention shifted to her completely, and for a moment something flickered in his cold blue eyes, surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been recognition. He moved closer, studying not just her question but the elegant way she held herself, the lack of fear in her direct gaze, the artistic skill evident in even her hastily carved words. "You cannot hear," he said, though it wasn't really a question. When Elenna nodded calmly, he continued with something that sounded almost like wonder. "Yet you show no fear of me." "Interesting." Thomas stepped protectively closer to his daughter. "She is all I have left, Alaric. Take anything else, the cottage, what little money I've saved, my own life if necessary, but please, leave Elenna out of this. Your life." Alaric's laugh held no warmth. "What use would I have for the life of an aging carpenter? Your money?" His gaze swept their humble surroundings with obvious dismissal. I could burn what you own and lose nothing of value. Elenna carved another message, this one taking longer as she chose her words carefully. He saved my mother's life and mine. That was an act of love. What is the debt for such a gift? The vampire read her words slowly, and something in his expression shifted. He looked from the message board to her face, studying her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. The debt, child, is whatever the creditor deems appropriate. I have waited 30 years to collect, allowing your father to enjoy the life I made possible. Now that time has ended. Then what do you want? Thomas's voice cracked with desperation. Alaric continued to study Elenna, noting her steady breathing, her composed expression, the way she met his gaze without flinching. Most mortals couldn't look directly at him for more than a few seconds without being overcome by instinctive terror. This young woman seemed immune to the supernatural fear that was part of his very nature. I want, he said slowly, what is most precious to you, something that carries the weight of the sacrifice I made 30 years ago. The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. No, please, anything but, she will come with me, Alaric announced, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. Your daughter will settle the debt her birth created. Elenna's hands stilled on her message board. She looked from her father's stricken face to the vampire's impassive expression, then began carving with swift, decisive strokes. When she finished, she held up her board with steady hands. If I agree, will my father's debt be considered paid in full? Elenna. No. Thomas reached for her, but she stepped back, her expression resolute. Alaric read her message with growing interest. You would come willingly? She carved again, her movements quick but precise. To protect my father, yes. But I want your word that this settles everything between you. The vampire studied her for a long moment, clearly taken aback by her negotiation. In all his centuries, few mortals had faced him with such composure, and none had attempted to set terms for their own capture. You have my word, he said finally. If you come with me now, your father's debt will be cleared completely. Thomas stepped between them, his face pale but determined. I won't let you take her. She's innocent in all of this. She is the result of our bargain, Alaric replied coolly. Without my intervention, she would never have drawn breath. In a sense, her life already belongs to me. Elenna touched her father's arm gently, then carved one final message. I love you, Papa. Trust that I can take care of myself. Some debts must be paid. Before Thomas could protest further, she gathered a small cloth bag from beside her chair, a travel sack she had prepared without realizing why, and moved toward the door. Her calm acceptance of the situation seemed to unsettle even Alaric, who had clearly expected tears, pleading, or attempts at escape. You will find her strong-willed, Thomas said, his voice hollow with grief and helpless rage. She has lived without hearing since birth, but she sees more clearly than most. If you harm her, threats, Thomas. Alaric's tone carried mild amusement. From a man who owes me everything? Elenna paused at the threshold, looking back at her father with eyes that held both sorrow and a strange kind of peace. She carved quickly on a small piece of wood she pulled from her bag. Remember me? Carving birds in the garden. I will find my way back to you somehow. With that, she stepped into the night beside the vampire who had come to collect his due. Thomas watched helplessly as they disappeared into the darkness, Elenna's small figure walking calmly beside the creature of shadow and legend who now held her life in his ancient hands. The cottage felt impossibly empty in their wake, filled only with the echo of 30 years of borrowed happiness coming to its inevitable end. The path through the forest existed in a perpetual state between night and twilight, where ancient trees formed a canopy so dense that moonlight filtered through in scattered silver patches. Elenna walked beside Alaric with a steady pace that matched his own, neither hurrying nor lagging, despite the uncertainty of her destination. The vampire found himself glancing at her more frequently than he intended, puzzled by her continued composure as they moved deeper into territory that had frightened mortals for centuries. The silence between them was not uncomfortable for Elenna. Her world had always been quiet, but she noticed how Alaric seemed to struggle with it. He appeared accustomed to the sounds of fear, quickened breathing, whispered prayers, the subtle signs of panic that typically accompanied his presence. Instead, he walked beside someone who breathed evenly and observed their surroundings with the curiosity of an artist rather than the terror of a captive. "Are you not afraid?" he asked, finally, his voice cutting through the stillness with unexpected gentleness. Elenna pulled a small piece of wood from her travel bag, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. Her carving knife moved swiftly in the dim light, guided by years of practice that allowed her to work by touch alone. When she finished, she held up her response. "Fear of what? You gave your word about my father's debt. What happens to me now is a new story." Alaric read her words with growing bewilderment. In his long existence, he had collected debts from kings and peasants, scholars and warriors, but none had approached their fate with such pragmatic acceptance. "You trust the word of a vampire?" Her knife moved again, carving with economical strokes. "I trust that you honor your agreements. Otherwise, people would stop making bargains with you." The logic was sound, and it surprised him. Most mortals viewed vampires as creatures of pure malice, incapable of honor or consistency. This young woman seemed to understand that his supernatural nature didn't negate the necessity of maintaining his reputation for reliability. A debt collector who broke his word would soon find himself without clients. The forest around them grew denser as they traveled, with paths that seemed to shift when not directly observed. Elenna noticed how the landscape responded to Alaric's presence. Shadows deepened where he walked, and certain flowers closed their petals as he passed. Rather than being frightened by these supernatural signs, she found herself fascinated by the relationship between the vampire and the natural world around him. They paused beside a stream that ran black as ink in the filtered moonlight. Alaric gestured for her to drink if she needed water, and Elenna knelt beside the bank, cupping the liquid in her hands. It tasted clean and cold, despite its dark appearance, and she realized that, like many things in this place, the stream was not quite what it seemed on the surface. "Your father never told you about our bargain," Alaric observed, as she dried her hands on the cloth from her bag. Elenna carved her response on a larger piece of wood. "He carried guilt about something connected to my birth and mother's death. I knew he had made a sacrifice for us, but not the details. Some secrets are too heavy to share with those we love." Reading her words, Alaric felt an unexpected twist of something that might have been respect. Her understanding of her father's burden showed a maturity that impressed him, and her lack of resentment about being kept in ignorance spoke to a wisdom that many never achieved regardless of age. "You do not blame him for the choice that led to this moment?" Her carving knife paused, and for the first time, Elenna's expression showed something other than calm acceptance. When she resumed carving, her strokes were more deliberate. "He chose love over loss. He saved my mother long enough for me to know her touch, and he saved me so I could grow up knowing his. I am here because he refused to let us die. How could I blame him for that?" The words struck Alaric with unexpected force. In his centuries of existence, he had grown accustomed to collecting debts from people who regretted their bargains, who cursed him for holding them to agreements made in desperation. Elenna was the first who seemed to understand that her very existence was the gift her father had purchased with his promise. As they resumed walking, the path began to rise, winding up a hillside that grew steeper with each turn. Ancient stones jutted from the earth like the bones of some long-dead giant, and the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of old power. Elenna noticed how Alaric's posture straightened as they climbed, how his expression grew more guarded, as if they were approaching something significant. The castle appeared gradually through the trees, its dark towers rising against the star-scattered sky like accusations aimed at heaven. Built from black stone that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, it perched on the hilltop like a predator surveying its domain. Elenna stopped walking to study the structure, her artist's eye taking in the Gothic arches, the gargoyles that crouched along the roofline, and the windows that glowed with pale, cold light. Rather than being intimidated by the imposing fortress, she found herself appreciating its craftsmanship. Someone had taken great care in its construction, choosing each stone and arch with an eye for both beauty and strength. The gargoyles were not mere decoration, but finely carved sculptures, each one unique in its expression of guardianship and warning. "Welcome to Ravenshollow," Alaric said, following her gaze as she studied his ancestral home. "It has been my residence for the better part of 4 centuries. Elenna carved quickly. "It's beautiful. Lonely, but beautiful." "Did you build it yourself?" "I inherited it from my predecessor, then modified it to suit my needs." There was something in his tone that suggested the inheritance had not been entirely peaceful. "Few mortals have called it beautiful. Most people fear what they don't understand," she carved in response. "But stone doesn't lie the way faces do. This place was built with pride, not malice." Her observation caught him off guard. The castle had indeed been constructed during a time when he still retained hope that his vampiric existence might include something beyond mere survival and predation. The fact that she could see past its forbidding exterior to recognize the care in its construction spoke to a perceptiveness that unsettled him. As they approached the massive front doors, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the torchlight, Alaric found himself hesitating. For 30 years, he had imagined this moment collecting Thomas Brennan's debt, claiming what was owed to him. He had expected to feel satisfaction, the completion of a long overdue transaction. Instead, he felt something closer to uncertainty, as if he were about to cross a threshold that would change more than just his guest's circumstances. The doors opened at his touch, swinging inward without sound to reveal a grand entrance hall lit by candles that never seemed to burn down. Tapestries hung from the walls depicting scenes of hunts and battles, while suits of armor stood silent guard along the corridors that led deeper into the castle's heart. Everything spoke of wealth and power, carefully maintained across centuries of solitary existence. Elenna stepped into the hall with the same calm composure she had shown throughout their journey, her eyes taking in the grandeur without being overwhelmed by it. She moved toward one of the tapestries, studying the intricate weaving with professional appreciation, her fingers tracing the air just above the threads as if she could feel the craftsmanship through proximity alone. Hidden behind a pillar, barely visible in the shadows of the great hall, hung a portrait covered by a dust-laden cloth. Neither Elenna nor Alaric noticed it in that moment, but it waited there like a secret preparing to reveal itself, a painting of a young girl with eyes that held the same fearless curiosity that Elenna carried, a daughter lost to time and tragedy who had once called this cold castle home. "Your room is prepared," Alaric said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Tomorrow we will discuss the terms of your residence here." Elenna carved one final message before following him up the grand staircase. "Thank you for bringing me somewhere beautiful. Even captivity can be bearable in a place built with love." As they climbed toward the castle's upper floors, neither of them noticed how the covered portrait seemed to stir in the draught their passing created, or how the eyes in the hidden painting seemed to follow their progress with the weight of memory waiting to be awakened. The room Alaric had prepared for Elenna occupied the castle's eastern tower, where tall windows faced the sunrise and allowed natural light to flood the space during the morning hours. Unlike the rest of the castle's deliberately imposing decor, this chamber had been furnished with unexpected consideration. A comfortable bed with clean linens, a writing desk positioned to catch the best light, and shelves lined with books whose leather bindings showed the patina of age and careful handling. Elenna spent her first morning exploring the space with the methodical attention she brought to all new environments. She discovered that the windows opened easily, allowing fresh air to circulate and carrying the sounds of birds that she couldn't hear, but whose movements she could observe in the courtyard below. The desk held writing materials of a quality she had never seen: fine paper, ink that flowed like liquid night, and quills that had been carefully prepared for smooth writing. Most intriguingly, she found that someone had placed several pieces of uncarved wood on the desk, along with a set of carving tools that surpassed anything she had owned. The knives were perfectly balanced, their edges sharp enough to slice through pine as if it were butter, and the handles had been worn smooth by long use. Someone who understood her craft had selected these tools with care. Her artistic instincts immediately drew her to the wood, and she began her first carving in the castle, a simple relief of the sunrise as it appeared through her window. Working with such fine tools felt like discovering a new language, allowing her to capture details and subtleties that her rougher implements at home had never permitted. The carving became a meditation, her hands moving with practiced precision, while her mind processed the strange turn her life had taken. Alaric found her there an hour after sunrise, bent over her work with the focused intensity of a master craftsman. He had come to check on her welfare, a courtesy he told himself was merely practical, but stopped in the doorway when he saw what she was creating. The wooden sunrise seemed to glow with captured light, each ray carved with such delicacy that it appeared to move in the morning breeze from the windows. "You work quickly," he observed, stepping into the room with the careful movement of someone unsure of his welcome. Elenna looked up from her carving, studying his face for a moment before reaching for a message board. Her response came swiftly. "Good tools make good work possible. These are the finest I've ever used." "Thank you." "They belong to—" Alaric began, then stopped himself. The tools had indeed belonged to someone else, someone whose memory he wasn't ready to examine closely. "I thought you might appreciate quality implements." She set down her carving knife and wrote a longer message. "The room is beautiful. The view reminds me of home, but the space feels like it was prepared for someone who enjoys both solitude and creativity. Was this your daughter's room?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Alaric had grown skilled at deflecting inquiries about his past, but Elenna's directness and the matter-of-fact way she had arrived at the truth left him momentarily speechless. Her ability to read the emotional resonance of spaces was proving as sharp as her artistic vision. "What makes you think I had a daughter?" he asked, though his voice carried none of his usual commanding certainty. Elenna gestured around the room, then carved her explanation. "The furniture is sized for someone smaller than you. The books are fairy tales and poetry, not histories or philosophy. The carving tools show wear from delicate hands, not large ones. And this room has been maintained with love, not mere housekeeping." Her observations were painfully accurate. The room had indeed been preserved exactly as his daughter Isabella had left it, down to the bookmark, still marking her place in a collection of sonnets she had been reading the night she died. For nearly 3 centuries, Alaric had kept the space as a shrine to memory, visiting it only when the weight of solitude became unbearable. "Isabella," he said quietly, the name feeling strange on his lips after so many years of silence. "She would have been about your age when I lost her." Elenna's expression softened with understanding rather than pity. She wrote carefully, "I'm honored to stay in her room. Would you tell me about her?" The request was so gently made, so free of the curiosity that demanded rather than invited, that Alaric found himself sitting in the chair beside her desk. For a moment he simply looked around the room, seeing it through Elenna's eyes, not as a monument to loss, but as a space where someone had been loved and happy. "She was curious about everything," he began, his voice carrying the weight of long-suppressed memory. "She would fill these shelves with specimens she found in the gardens, pressed flowers, interesting stones, feathers from rare birds. She carved small figures of the animals she observed, trying to capture their personalities in wood. Elenna nodded encouragingly, her hands still as she listened with her whole attention. Isabella had a gift for seeing beauty in unexpected places. She could find wonder in a spider's web covered with morning dew, or in the way shadows fell across the courtyard at different times of day. Her laughter filled this castle with light. "What happened to her?" Elenna wrote, though her touch was gentle as she showed him the message. Alaric was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, each one carefully controlled. "She died of a fever when she was 26. I was not yet a vampire then. That came later, in my desperate attempts to find a way to bring her back. By the time I gained the power that might have saved her, she was already gone." Understanding dawned in Elenna's expression. She wrote with swift strokes, "You became a vampire trying to save her, but it was too late. Yes, and in my grief and rage, I became something she would have feared. The father she loved was replaced by a creature who collected debts and inspired terror. I have spent 3 centuries becoming the opposite of everything she believed I could be." Elenna studied his face as he spoke, seeing past the supernatural beauty to the pain that had shaped him. When she responded, her message was longer than usual. "Grief changes us, but it doesn't erase who we were before. Your daughter's room shows that you haven't forgotten how to love, you've just forgotten how to let yourself feel it. Maybe she left this room for someone like me to find, so you could remember what she saw in you." Her words carried a gentle wisdom that struck him more deeply than any argument or accusation could have. Looking around Isabella's preserved room, seeing Elenna's sunrise carving catching the morning light, Alaric felt something stir within him that he had thought permanently buried with his daughter's small body. "You may stay here as long as you wish," he said finally. "Use whatever you need. The tools, the materials, the books." Isabella would have wanted her things to bring joy to someone who could appreciate them. Elenna smiled, the first true smile he had seen from her since their journey began, and carved a simple response, "Thank you. I'll take good care of her treasures." As Alaric left her to settle into Isabella's room, he found himself walking the castle's corridors with a different rhythm than he had known in centuries. The fortress that had been his prison of solitude was beginning to feel like something else, a place where conversation might bloom again, where the echoes of old laughter might find new voices to carry them forward. Behind him, Elenna returned to her carving, but now she worked with a deeper purpose. She was not just creating art, she was beginning to heal wounds that had festered in shadow for far too long. 3 days into her residence at Ravenshollow, Elenna had established a routine that brought unexpected rhythms to the ancient castle. She rose with the dawn, carved her morning observations while the light was strongest, and spent her afternoons exploring the vast fortress that had become her home. Alaric found himself unconsciously timing his activities around her patterns, emerging from his study when he knew she would be working in the gardens, lingering in corridors where he might glimpse her moving through the halls with purpose and grace. The castle itself seemed to be responding to her presence. Rooms that had been shuttered for decades were now filled with light as Elenna opened windows and drew back heavy curtains. Dust covers disappeared from furniture as she claimed spaces for her various projects, and the hollow echo that had marked Alaric's footsteps for centuries was softened by the presence of another soul moving through the halls. On the 4th morning, Elenna's explorations led her to a chamber she hadn't yet discovered, a circular room in the castle's western tower that had been locked away behind a door she initially mistook for a storage closet. The key turned easily in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her touch, and the door swung open to reveal something that made her breath catch in silent wonder. The room had clearly been a music chamber, designed for both performance and intimate gatherings. Tall windows provided excellent acoustics and natural light, while built-in seating curved along the walls in a way that would have allowed listeners to surround performers with their attention. But it was the instrument at the room's center that captured Elenna's complete focus, a harpsichord of extraordinary craftsmanship. its dark wood inlaid with mother-of-pearl in patterns that seemed to dance in the morning light. Even more intriguingly, sitting atop the instrument was something she had never seen before, an ornate music box, its brass and ebony surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the intricate detail work of a master craftsman. The box was slightly larger than her cupped hands, with a winding key that turned smoothly despite the years of neglect. When she opened the lid, a melody began to play, a hauntingly beautiful waltz that seemed to fill the entire chamber with its gentle, crystalline notes. Elenna sat on the bench before the harpsichord, mesmerized by the music box's song. Though she couldn't hear the melody, she could feel the vibrations through the wooden surfaces, could see the delicate mechanical dancer that spun within the box as the music played. The craftsmanship spoke to her artistic soul, and she found herself studying every detail of the mechanism, trying to understand how such beauty could emerge from such precise, tiny movements. She was so absorbed in her examination that she didn't notice Alaric's arrival until his shadow fell across the music box. When she looked up, she saw an expression on his face that she had never witnessed before, a mixture of pain and longing so intense that it seemed to physically wound him. "You found Isabella's music room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elenna immediately moved to close the music box, understanding that she had stumbled into another shrine to his lost daughter, but Alaric gestured for her to let it continue playing. He moved to one of the window seats, settling himself where he could watch both her and the spinning dancer that continued its eternal waltz within the box. She loved music more than anything else in the world. He continued, his eyes fixed on the delicate figure. "I commissioned that box for her 16th birthday. The melody was her favorite. She would hum it while she worked in the gardens, while she read. While she carved her little wooden animals, Elenna reached for her message board, writing with careful strokes. She must have been very talented. This harpsichord is magnificent. She played beautifully. The whole castle would come alive when she practiced. Servants would find excuses to work near this room just to listen to her music. Even the birds in the courtyard seemed to gather when she played, as if they recognized a kindred spirit. The music box wound down gradually, its melody slowing until the dancer finally came to rest. In the silence that followed, Elenna could see how the absence of sound affected Alaric. His shoulders sagged as if the music had been holding him upright, and his eyes grew distant with memory. She wrote another message. "Would you show me how to wind it? I'd like to repair it if it needs maintenance." Alaric looked at her with surprise. "You would do that? Beautiful things deserve to be preserved. And if this brought her joy, then keeping it working is a way of honoring her memory." Her practical approach to his daughter's treasures continued to astonish him. Where he had preserved Isabella's belongings as untouchable monuments, Elenna saw them as tools for connection, objects meant to be used, maintained, and cherished, through active care rather than fearful distance. Together, they examined the music box's mechanism. Elenna's experience with fine woodworking translated well to understanding the delicate gears and springs that powered the melody, and she quickly identified several areas where careful cleaning and oiling would restore the box to perfect working order. Alaric watched her gentle, sure hands as she worked, remembering how Isabella had approached mechanical puzzles with the same focused curiosity. "She would have liked you," he said suddenly, the words emerging before he could think to stop them. Elenna paused in her work, looking up at him with questioning eyes. "Isabella was drawn to people who saw the world differently," he explained. "She believed that everyone had a unique perspective that could teach her something new. Your way of experiencing the world through touch and sight instead of sound, she would have found that fascinating, not limiting." Elenna smiled and carved a quick response. "I think I would have liked her too. Anyone who could fill a castle with music and laughter must have had a gift for joy." As she returned to her delicate work on the music box, Alaric found himself sharing more memories of Isabella, her habit of collecting interesting stones to arrange on her windowsill, her attempts to teach the castle cats to respond to hand signals, her infectious enthusiasm for small discoveries that others might overlook. With each story, the room seemed to grow warmer, as if Isabella's spirit was pleased to have her treasures in caring hands once again. The music box's repair took most of the afternoon, but when Elenna finally wound it again, the melody played with a clarity and richness that had been absent for decades. The dancer spun with renewed grace, and the crystalline notes filled the chamber with the kind of beauty that made even shadows seem less dark. "There," Elenna wrote, setting down her tools with satisfaction. "Now it can continue bringing joy for many more years." Alaric reached out to touch the music box gently, his fingers tracing the patterns Isabella had loved. "Thank you," he said simply. "I had forgotten what it sounded like when it worked properly." As evening approached and the western light began to fade, neither of them moved to leave the music room. The restored melody played again and again, each repetition seeming to weave new connections between past and present, memory and hope. The daughter who had been lost, and the young woman who had found her way into the heart of a castle built on grief. For the first time in 3 centuries, Alaric began to understand that preserving the past might not require keeping it frozen in place. Perhaps true honor came from allowing love to grow and change, to find new expressions through new hearts that could appreciate old beauties without being crushed by the weight of what had been lost. A week had passed since Elenna's arrival at Raven's Hollow, and the village of Thornwick buzzed with whispered conversations and worried glances toward the forest. Thomas Brennan had not been seen at the market or the church since the night his daughter was taken, and those brave enough to visit his cottage found it shuttered and silent, as if grief had swallowed the man whole. Father Benedict tried to maintain calm among his parishioners, but even his sermons carried an underlying tension that reflected the community's unease. The vampire lord's return had awakened old fears, and the knowledge that he had claimed one of their own left everyone feeling vulnerable and helpless. Some whispered that they should organize a rescue attempt, while others insisted that challenging a creature of Alaric's power would only bring destruction upon them all. It was Mrs. Hartwell, the baker whose kind heart had always extended toward Thomas and Elenna, who finally decided that someone must act. She had been Thomas's friend since childhood, had helped deliver Elenna into the world, and had watched the girl grow into a young woman whose gentle spirit had touched everyone in the village. The thought of that bright soul trapped in a monster's lair was more than she could bear. On the 7th night after Elenna's disappearance, Mrs. Hartwell made her way through the forest, carrying a bundle that had taken her days to prepare. She had sewn a silver cross into the lining of her cloak, carried blessed water in a small vial around her neck, and filled her pockets with garlic and rowan berries, every protection she could remember from the old stories her grandmother had told. Her heart hammered with terror as she followed the path that local folklore claimed led to the vampire's domain, but her love for Elenna and Thomas drove her forward despite her fear. The castle appeared through the trees like something from a nightmare, its dark towers reaching toward the starlit sky, with architectural elegance that somehow made it more frightening rather than less. Mrs. Hartwell had expected something crude and threatening, but Raven's Hollow's beauty was cold and perfect in a way that spoke of supernatural power held in careful control. She approached the massive gates with trembling steps, unsure how to gain entry or whether she truly wanted to succeed in her mission. Before she could lose her nerve entirely, the gates swung open without sound, as if her presence had been anticipated. The courtyard beyond lay bathed in pale moonlight, empty except for the shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. "You are expected," came a voice from the darkness near the castle's entrance. Mrs. Hartwell nearly fled at the sound, but then Alaric stepped into the light, and she saw him clearly for the first time. The reality of his presence was somehow worse than her imagination. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, with pale skin that seemed to glow with its own light, and eyes that held depths of knowledge she didn't want to contemplate. "I've come for Elenna," she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "I've come to take her home." "Have you?" Alaric's tone carried mild curiosity rather than anger. "And what makes you think she wishes to leave?" The question caught Mrs. Hartwell off guard. She had assumed that Elenna was being held against her will, imprisoned in some dark dungeon or chained in a tower cell. The possibility that the girl might not want rescue had never occurred to her. "She's been taken from her family, from everyone who loves her," Mrs. Hartwell said, finding strength in her conviction. "Of course she wants to come home." "Perhaps you should ask her yourself," Alaric replied, gesturing toward the castle's entrance. "I believe she is working in the music room at this hour." The casual mention of a music room, as if Elenna were a guest pursuing hobbies rather than a captive enduring imprisonment, further confused Mrs. Hartwell. But she followed Alaric through corridors lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on tapestried walls, past doorways that revealed glimpses of rooms furnished with obvious wealth and care. The sound of the music box reached them long before they arrived at the chamber itself, a delicate melody that seemed to float through the castle like a gentle spirit. Mrs. Hartwell had never heard anything so beautiful, and despite her fear and confusion, she found herself drawn toward the source of the ethereal music. They found Elenna seated at a magnificent harpsichord, her attention focused on a piece of wood she was carving, while the ornate music box played its endless waltz nearby. She looked up as they entered, and Mrs. Hartwell's breath caught at the transformation she saw. The girl was not pale with terror or marked by mistreatment. Instead, she appeared healthier than she had in months, her eyes bright with purpose and her posture relaxed in a way that spoke of genuine contentment. Elenna's face lit with surprise and pleasure when she recognized her visitor. She immediately reached for her message board, carving with quick strokes. "Mrs. Hartwell, how wonderful to see you. Are you well? How is Papa?" "Child, I've come to take you home," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Your father is beside himself with grief. The whole village is worried sick about you." Elenna's expression grew serious, and she carved more slowly. "I know Papa is hurting. I miss him terribly. But I'm not being harmed here, and my presence serves a purpose beyond just settling the debt." "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Hartwell asked, glancing nervously at Alaric, who had remained silent during their exchange. Elenna's response took several minutes to carve. "This castle holds centuries of pain and isolation. There are wounds here that need healing, memories that need honoring, and connections that need rebuilding. I think I was meant to be here for more than just payment of an old bargain." Mrs. Hartwell read the words with growing bewilderment. This was not the frightened victim she had expected to find, but a young woman who spoke of purpose and healing in a vampire's fortress. "Elenna, you can't possibly mean that you want to stay here with—" She gestured helplessly toward Alaric. "With someone who is learning to be more than his grief defines him." Elenna carved firmly. "Mrs. Hartwell, not all prisons have bars, and not all monsters are what they first appear to be. Sometimes the greatest captivity comes from being trapped by our own pain." Alaric watched this exchange with growing amazement. Elenna was defending not just her decision to remain, but his capacity for change, something he wasn't sure he believed in himself. Her words carried a conviction that transformed how he saw their unusual arrangement. "Please tell Papa that I'm safe and well cared for," Elenna continued. "Tell him that his sacrifice gave me life, and now I'm using that gift to help heal someone else's wounds. Tell him I love him and will see him again, but that right now, this is where I need to be." Mrs. Hartwell looked from Elenna's serene face to Alaric's thoughtful expression, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she believed about vampires and captivity. The girl showed no signs of supernatural influence or coercion. Her responses were entirely her own, delivered with the same gentle wisdom she had always displayed. "You truly wish to stay here, Mrs. Hartwell asked one final time. Elenna nodded firmly, then carved. "I've found something here that I didn't expect the chance to make a difference in someone's centuries of loneliness. Papa taught me that love sometimes requires sacrifice, but he also taught me that sacrifice can create something beautiful. I'm not being held against my will. I'm choosing to stay." As Mrs. Hartwell prepared to leave, carrying Elenna's message back to a worried father and frightened village, she realized that she had witnessed something far more complex than a simple rescue mission. She had seen a young woman choosing to remain in a place of darkness because she believed her presence could kindle light. The journey home through the forest seemed shorter than her terrified approach, and when she reached Thornwick, she carried news that would challenge everything the villagers thought they knew about monsters, captivity, and the unexpected ways that healing could bloom in the most unlikely places. Mrs. Hartwell's visit had stirred something in the castle's atmosphere that Elenna could feel even in her silent world. Alaric had grown restless after the baker's departure, pacing the corridors with an energy that seemed part anticipation and part dread. When she found him 3 days later, standing before the covered portrait in the great hall, the one she had noticed but never examined closely, she sensed that the time for hidden truths was approaching its end. "You've been avoiding this," she wrote on her message board, joining him before the dust-laden cloth. "What are you afraid I'll see?" Alaric's hand moved toward the covering, then stopped. Some revelations change everything that came before them. Once you know certain truths, you cannot unknow them. Truth has a way of emerging whether we're ready or not. Elenna carved in response. "And I've found that secrets cause more pain than honesty ever could." With deliberate care, Alaric pulled away the cloth that had hidden the portrait for decades. What emerged from beneath the dust and darkness made Elenna's breath catch in her throat. The painting showed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, with dark curls and bright eyes that held an expression of fearless curiosity. But it was not this child who made Elenna stare in wonder. It was the man who stood behind her in the portrait, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders. The man in the painting was human, mortal, with warm brown eyes and a smile that spoke of deep contentment. He looked nothing like the pale, ethereal vampire who stood beside her now, yet the bone structure was unmistakably the same. This was Alaric as he had been before supernatural transformation, a father whose love for his daughter radiated from every brushstroke. "That was painted 2 years before Isabella died," Alaric said quietly, "before I became what you see now." Elenna studied the portrait with growing understanding, then moved to a nearby chair where she could carve a longer response. "You were human when you lost her. The vampire transformation came after her death, not before. You didn't become a monster and lose your daughter. You lost your daughter and became a monster. The distinction matters less than the result," Alaric replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "The distinction matters entirely," Elenna carved with firm strokes. "It changes everything about who you are and why you've spent centuries in isolation." She set down her carving knife and walked to a bookshelf that lined the hall's eastern wall. Her hands moved along the volumes with practiced efficiency, searching for something she had glimpsed during her earlier explorations of the castle. When she found what she sought, a leather-bound journal with pages yellowed by age, she brought it to Alaric with careful reverence. "I found this in Isabella's room," she wrote. "I think it belonged to someone who was hunting vampires, someone who was looking for you." Alaric took the journal with hands that trembled slightly. The leather binding was familiar, though he had tried for decades to forget it. When he opened the cover, his own handwriting stared back at him, not the elegant script he had developed over centuries of supernatural existence, but the hurried, desperate notes of a mortal man consumed by grief and impossible hope. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Hidden behind Isabella's books, wrapped in a cloth that smelled of garlic and blessed herbs. Someone had concealed it very carefully, as if they wanted it preserved but not easily discovered." As Alaric read through the journal's pages, memories flooded back with painful clarity. He had written these entries in the months following Isabella's death, documenting his search for supernatural solutions to mortal loss. The pages chronicled his growing desperation as traditional medicine failed him, his investigation into folk remedies and ancient legends, and finally his contact with a vampire lord who promised the power to cheat death itself. "I sought out the vampire who made me," he said, his voice hollow with remembered pain. "I offered him anything, my soul, my humanity, my life, if he would grant me the power to bring Isabella back from the dead." Elenna read over his shoulder as he turned the pages, seeing the progression from hope to horror as his entries revealed the true cost of vampiric transformation. The final entries were written in a hand that shook with supernatural strength, poorly controlled, documenting his realization that the power he had gained came too late to save the daughter he loved. "You didn't choose to become a vampire for power or immortality," Elenna carved when he finished reading. "You chose it because you loved her so much that you were willing to damn yourself for even the smallest chance of saving her. And instead, I became exactly the kind of creature that would have terrified her," Alaric replied bitterly. "The gentle father she knew died with her. What emerged was something that has spent centuries inspiring fear and collecting debts like a merchant of darkness." Elenna studied the journal more carefully, turning to entries she had read before with new understanding. "But that's not entirely true, is it? Look at what you've actually done with your supernatural existence." She pointed to specific passages that detailed his activities over the centuries, not the predatory behavior of a typical vampire, but something far more complex. The debts he collected were almost always from people who had asked for his help first, desperate souls who sought supernatural intervention in moments of crisis. And the payment he demanded was rarely cruel or destructive. "You've spent 3 centuries helping people who had nowhere else to turn," she carved with growing excitement. "You saved my mother's life. Yes, but you also saved the merchant's son from plague, the farmer's crops from blight, the seamstress's husband from drowning. You became exactly what you sought, a creature with the power to prevent others from suffering the loss you endured." Alaric stared at his own writings, seeing them through Elenna's perspective for the first time. He had always focused on what he had become, rather than what he had chosen to do with his transformation. The fear he inspired, the isolation he endured, the monstrous reputation he had cultivated, all of it served to mask the fundamental truth that Elenna had discovered in his own records. "You never became a monster," she wrote on a fresh piece of wood. "You became a guardian who was so afraid of causing the kind of pain you experienced that you isolated yourself from everyone you tried to protect. But protection offered in solitude isn't connection, it's just another form of loss." The revelation struck him with the force of divine lightning. For 3 centuries, he had defined himself by what he had lost and what he had become, never recognizing that his actions consistently contradicted his self-perception. He had spent lifetimes preventing other families from experiencing his tragedy, but had been so consumed by guilt and grief that he couldn't see the heroism in his choices. "My reputation," he began, "was deliberately cultivated to keep people from getting too close," Elenna carved, "because closeness means vulnerability, and vulnerability means the possibility of loss. You've been protecting yourself from forming new connections that might end in the kind of pain Isabella's death caused." As if summoned by their conversation, a sound echoed through the castle's corridors, the distant clang of the front gates opening. Alaric's enhanced hearing caught what Elenna could not: the approach of multiple footsteps, accompanied by the whispered prayers and hushed planning that marked a group moving with fearful determination. "The villagers," he said, his voice tight with sudden tension. "They're coming for you." Elenna set down her carving tools and looked toward the castle's entrance with calm resolve. "Then perhaps it's time for all of us to stop hiding from the truth. They're afraid of a monster who doesn't exist, just as you've been afraid of connections that might heal rather than harm." As the sound of approaching voices grew closer, Carrying with it the weight of 3 decades of fear and misunderstanding, Alaric realized that the debt he had thought he was collecting had actually been collecting him. The payment he truly owed was not to himself, but to the memory of the man he had been before grief transformed him, the father who would have wanted his sacrifice to create healing rather than centuries of isolation. The time for hiding was ending, and with it, the possibility of finally becoming worthy of the daughter whose love had driven him to seek power in the first place. But first, he would have to face the villagers who had come to rescue someone who might not need rescuing, and convince them that sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones we create in our own minds. The villagers of Thornwick had never organized for war, but desperation had a way of teaching peaceful people the language of violence. Thomas Brennan walked at the front of the group, his face haggard with sleepless nights and his hands gripping a blessed sword that Father Benedict had retrieved from the church's hidden relics. Behind him followed 23 of Thornwick's most determined residents, each carrying weapons, holy symbols, or both. Mrs. Hartwell had tried to dissuade them from their mission, sharing her account of Elenna's apparent contentment and strange talk of healing ancient wounds. But her words had been dismissed as either supernatural influence or well-meaning delusion. The villagers had convinced themselves that no mortal could willingly remain with a creature like Alaric, and that Mrs. Hartwell's gentle heart had made her susceptible to vampiric deception. "She's been enchanted," proclaimed Edmund Thorne, the village's blacksmith and self-appointed leader of their rescue expedition. Everyone knows vampires can cloud human minds, make their victims believe they're safe when they're actually being prepared for feeding. "We can't trust anything," the beast allowed her to say. Father Benedict had blessed their weapons and offered prayers for their safety, though privately he harbored deep doubts about the wisdom of their crusade. He had seen Mrs. Hartwell's face when she returned from the castle, had heard the genuine conviction in her voice when she described Elenna's contentment. But the villagers' fear had reached a fever pitch that made rational discussion impossible. Thomas himself was torn between hope and anguish. Part of him desperately wanted to believe Mrs. Hartwell's account that his daughter was safe, well treated, and remaining by choice rather than coercion. But the rational part of his mind insisted that no good could come from association with a vampire, regardless of what supernatural influences might be clouding Elenna's judgment. The group had spent 3 days planning their assault, gathering every piece of folklore and religious knowledge they could find about confronting supernatural creatures. They carried silver weapons, bottles of holy water, strings of garlic, wooden stakes, and crosses blessed by Father Benedict himself. Edmund Thorne bore a torch that had been lit from the church's eternal flame, its fire supposedly capable of burning away evil influence. As they made their way through the forest, following the path that had become worn by decades of fearful avoidance, the villagers struggled with the reality of what they were attempting. None of them had ever faced a vampire before, and their knowledge came entirely from stories passed down through generations, tales that grew more terrible and fantastical with each telling. "Remember," Edmund called back to the group as they approached the forest's deeper shadows, "vampires are cunning creatures. They'll try to confuse us with words, make us doubt our purpose. We stay together, we follow the plan, and we don't listen to any lies it tries to tell us." Inside Ravenshollow, Alaric paced the great hall with supernatural grace that barely concealed his inner turmoil. His enhanced senses could track the villagers' progress through the forest, could hear their whispered prayers and muttered plans. They were afraid but determined, driven by love for Thomas and his daughter rather than mere bloodlust. Under different circumstances, he might have admired their courage. Elenna sat calmly at the hall's massive table, her carving tools spread before her as she worked on what might be her final piece. A relief carving that depicted 2 figures standing before a castle, their hands extended toward each other in a gesture that could be interpreted as either greeting or farewell. Her composure in the face of approaching danger both impressed and worried Alaric. "You could still leave," he said, breaking a silence that had stretched for nearly an hour. "I could ensure your safe passage back to the village before they arrive. You need not be part of whatever confrontation is coming." Elenna looked up from her carving, studying his face with the careful attention she brought to all her artistic subjects. When she reached for her message board, her movements were deliberate and calm. "Running away would prove their fears correct, that you're a monster who must be feared, and I'm a victim who needs rescuing. But we both know the truth now. It's time they learned it too. They come armed for war," Alaric pointed out. "They will not be easily convinced by words or gentle reasoning. Fear makes people deaf to truth." "Then we'll have to speak in a language louder than their fear," she carved in response. "Sometimes the only way to break old patterns is to refuse to participate in them." Alaric moved to the great windows that overlooked the castle's approach, watching the flickering torchlight that marked the villagers' steady advance. The sight stirred memories of other confrontations, other times when fear had driven mortals to challenge him. Usually he had ended such encounters quickly, using supernatural speed and strength to scatter his attackers without serious harm, but with enough terror to ensure they never returned. But this time felt different. This time he was not facing strangers driven by abstract fear, but people who loved someone he had come to care about deeply. This time, retreat into intimidation and isolation would not just preserve his solitude, it would destroy something precious that had grown between himself and Elenna. "There is another choice," he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. "I could release you publicly, renounce any claim to the debt your father owes, and disappear into the deep forest where they would never find me again. You would be free to return to your old life, and I would trouble no one ever again." Elenna's carving knife paused in its work. When she responded, her strokes were firm and decisive. "Is that what you want? To spend another 3 centuries in isolation, convinced that you're a monster who can only bring harm to those around you?" "What I want may be irrelevant," Alaric replied. "What matters is your safety and your happiness. My happiness," she carved slowly, "has grown to include your healing. Walking away now would be like abandoning a carving, half-finished possible, but a waste of something that could have been beautiful." Her words struck him with unexpected force. In 3 centuries of supernatural existence, no one had ever described their connection to him in terms of creating beauty rather than enduring darkness. The idea that his healing something he had never truly believed possible might be valuable enough to risk danger for was both humbling and terrifying. The sound of the castle gates opening echoed through the halls, followed by footsteps that crossed the courtyard with the heavy tread of people carrying both weapons and righteous determination. Alaric could hear Thomas's voice among the others, calling his daughter's name with a mixture of love and desperation that made something twist painfully in the vampire's chest. "They're here," he said unnecessarily. Elenna set down her carving tools and moved to stand beside him at the window. Together, they watched as the villagers arranged themselves in the courtyard below, their blessed weapons catching the moonlight, while their faces showed the strain of people preparing for a battle they weren't sure they could survive. "What is your plan?" Alaric asked. Elenna smiled, the expression that held both serenity and determination. "The truth," she carved quickly. "All of it. The real story of Isabella's death, your transformation, the centuries you've spent protecting other families from the loss you endured. And most importantly, the choice I'm making to help you heal from wounds that have festered too long in darkness." "They may not believe us," Alaric warned. "Then we'll have to make them believe," she carved in response. "Sometimes the only way to defeat fear is to show it something greater: love, truth, courage, hope. We have all of those on our side." As if summoned by their conversation, Thomas's voice rose from the courtyard below, calling for his daughter with heartbreaking desperation. The sound carried clearly through the castle's stone halls, reaching even Elenna's silent world through the vibrations it created in the ancient walls. "My father," she wrote, her composure finally showing a crack of emotion. He's suffered so much because of choices made in love. It's time to show him that love can heal as well as sacrifice. Alaric looked down at the assembled villagers, then at the young woman whose presence had begun to transform centuries of self-imposed exile into something that might, possibly, become redemption. The approaching confrontation would determine not just their immediate fate, but whether healing was possible for wounds that had seemed eternal. "Together, then," he said simply. Elenna nodded, gathering her message boards with hands that remained steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. As they prepared to descend to the castle's main floor, she carved one final message. "Sometimes the greatest courage is simply refusing to hide from who we really are." The truth was waiting for them in the courtyard below, surrounded by torches, weapons, and hearts full of love transformed into fearful determination. Whether that truth would bring healing or destruction remained to be seen, but for the first time in centuries, Alaric was willing to risk finding out. The age of isolation was ending, and with it, perhaps, the age of fear. The great doors of Ravenshollow swung open without sound, revealing Alaric and Elenna standing side by side in the castle's entrance. The sight stopped the villagers' advance immediately, their weapons half raised as they processed the unexpected tableau before them. Instead of a cowering victim and a menacing captor, they saw two figures standing together with calm dignity, neither displaying fear nor aggression. Thomas's sword wavered in his grip as he stared at his daughter. Elenna appeared not just unharmed, but somehow more vibrant than he remembered, her posture confident and her expression serene. She wore a simple dress that had clearly been provided by her host, and her hair was arranged with care that spoke of gentle treatment rather than captivity. "Elenna!" Thomas called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "Come away from there. Come home." Rather than responding immediately, Elenna moved toward a rope that hung beside the castle's entrance, a rope that led upward to the ancient bell tower that crowned Ravenshallow's highest spire. The bell itself was a massive bronze creation cast centuries ago with symbols and inscriptions that spoke of protection, sanctuary, and the calling of souls to witness truth. She pulled the rope with steady rhythm, and the bell's voice rang out across the valley with a clarity that seemed to cut through the night air like a blade of pure sound. Though Elenna couldn't hear the resonant notes that poured from the bronze, she could feel them in her bones, in the very stones of the castle, in the way the air itself seemed to vibrate with ancient power. The villagers lowered their weapons slightly, confused by the bell's unexpected song. In local tradition, bells were rung to call people to witness important events, marriages, births, deaths, or proclamations that would affect the entire community. None of them had expected to hear such a sound from the vampire's stronghold. Edmund Thorne stepped forward, his blessed torch held high. "Enough tricks, monster! Release the girl and face judgment for your crimes." Elenna stopped ringing the bell and moved toward her father, her message board held carefully in both hands. She had prepared this message during their wait in the great hall, carving each word with the precision that came from knowing this might be the most important thing she would ever write. "Papa," she showed him the board, "I love you. I am here by choice, not compulsion. Please listen with your heart, not your fear." Thomas read the words, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and pain. "You can't mean that. Elenna, you've been enchanted, influenced by dark magic. This creature has twisted your mind." Elenna shook her head firmly and carved another message. "Mrs. Hartwell told you the truth. I am thinking clearly, deciding freely, and choosing to remain because healing is possible here for all of us." "Healing?" Father Benedict spoke up, his voice carrying priestly authority. "Child, what healing can come from consorting with the undead? Such creatures are abominations against God's natural order." Before Elenna could respond, Alaric stepped forward, and every villager tensed as his supernatural presence became fully apparent. In the torchlight, his pale skin seemed to glow with inner light, and his movements carried the fluid grace that marked him as something beyond mortal limitations. "You speak of God's natural order, priest," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly to every member of the assembled group. "Tell me, what is natural about a father's love for his child? What is natural about the willingness to sacrifice everything for another's welfare? What is natural about the mercy that allows forgiveness even for those who have caused great harm?" The questions hung in the air like challenges, and Father Benedict found himself struggling to respond. These were not the words of a creature devoted to evil, but the philosophical inquiries of someone who had wrestled with profound, spiritual questions. "You're a vampire," Edmund Thorne declared, as if stating this fact settled all moral complexity. "Your very existence is an offense against the divine order." "Yes, I am a vampire," Alaric replied with calm acceptance. "I became one in my desperate attempt to gain the power to save my dying daughter. I failed to save her, but I have spent 3 centuries using that power to prevent other families from enduring the loss that destroyed me. Including," he gestured toward Thomas, "saving this man's wife and ensuring his daughter's birth." The admission sent ripples of confusion through the crowd. They had come prepared to face a monster, not to hear confessions of protective purpose driven by paternal love. Several villagers exchanged uncertain glances, their conviction beginning to waver in the face of unexpected complexity. Thomas stepped closer to his daughter, his eyes searching her face for signs of supernatural influence. "Elenna, if this is truly your choice, help me understand. Why would you willingly remain with a creature of darkness?" Elenna's response came swiftly, her carving knife moving with practiced efficiency. "Because darkness is not his nature, it's his prison. He has spent centuries believing he was a monster when he was actually a guardian. Someone needed to show him the truth about who he really is." As the bell's final echoes faded into the night, the courtyard fell into a tense silence that was broken only by the whispered prayers of villagers struggling to reconcile their expectations with the reality unfolding before them. The confrontation they had anticipated was becoming something else entirely, a moment of truth that would challenge everything they believed about good, evil, and the possibility of redemption. The moment of revelation came when Thomas dropped his blessed sword, the weapon clattering against the courtyard stones with a sound that seemed to echo through centuries of fear and misunderstanding. His shoulders sagged as the weight of 30 years of guilt finally found its voice. "It's true," he said, his words carrying across the silent courtyard with the force of confession. "Everything he says about the bargain is true. Elenna's mother was dying, our daughter was trapped in the womb, and I had no choice but to seek supernatural help. I made the deal willingly, desperately, knowing the debt would come due someday." The villagers turned to stare at Thomas, with expressions ranging from shock to betrayal. They had followed him into battle believing they were rescuing an innocent victim from an unprovoked attack, not collecting payment for a debt willingly incurred. "You knew?" "Mrs." Hartwell asked, her voice heavy with understanding. "All these years, you knew this day would come?" Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I counted every sunrise as borrowed time, every moment with my daughter as a gift I hadn't earned. When he came to collect, I tried to offer him everything else I had. But the truth was simple. Elenna's life existed because of his intervention. The debt was always going to be her." Edmund Thorne stepped forward, his torch wavering as his certainty crumbled. "But vampires are evil creatures. They corrupt and destroy everything they touch. How can you stand there and defend one?" Elenna moved to her father's side, placing a gentle hand on his arm before carving her response. "Evil is a choice, not a nature. For 3 centuries, he chose to use his power to prevent other families from suffering the loss that created him. That sounds more like an angel than a monster to me." Alaric watched this exchange with growing amazement, seeing his own story reflected back to him through Elenna's words and Thomas's confession. For the first time in centuries, he was being seen not as a creature to be feared, but as someone who had made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. "The chains," he said suddenly, understanding flooding through him like dawn breaking over a long night. "All this time, I thought the villagers' fear was what kept me isolated, but it was my own guilt that forged the real prison. I bound myself with shame over what I became, never recognizing that what I did with my transformation mattered more than the circumstances of its beginning." As if responding to his words, the supernatural aura that had always surrounded him seemed to shift and lighten. The pale glow that emanated from his skin became warmer, less cold and forbidding. Several villagers noticed the change, their grip on, their weapons loosening as the instinctive fear that vampires inspired began to fade. Father Benedict stepped forward, his face showing the struggle of a man whose theological certainties were being challenged by lived reality. "If what you say is true, if you have spent centuries protecting families rather than preying upon them, then perhaps we have misunderstood the nature of your curse." "Not a curse," Elenna carved quickly, holding up her message for all to see. "A calling." He was given the power to prevent others from experiencing his loss, and he answered that call faithfully for 300 years. The only tragedy was that he did it alone, believing himself unworthy of connection or gratitude. Thomas looked at his daughter with eyes that held both pride and sorrow. "You see something in him that I was too frightened to recognize. You see the man who saved your mother and made your life possible. I see someone who loved his daughter so much that he was willing to sacrifice his humanity for even the smallest chance of saving her," Elenna carved. "And when that failed, he spent centuries ensuring that other fathers wouldn't have to face the same impossible choice. The transformation was visible now, not just in Alaric's appearance, but in the very atmosphere of the courtyard. The oppressive sense of dread that had surrounded him for centuries was lifting, replaced by something that felt more like sanctuary than threat. The villagers found themselves able to look directly at him without the supernatural fear that had defined their ancestors' relationship with his kind. "The debt," Alaric said, his voice carrying new strength and clarity. "I released Thomas Brennan from all obligation. The payment I sought was never about possession or revenge. It was about connection, about finding someone who could help me remember what I was before grief transformed me into something I barely recognized." Edmund Thorne lowered his torch completely, the righteous fire that had driven their expedition guttering out in the face of unexpected truth. "So you don't intend to harm her? To turn her into a creature like yourself?" "I intend to honor the choice she has made," Alaric replied. "Elenna came to my castle as payment for a debt, but she will remain only as long as she wishes, for reasons that are entirely her own." The broken chains of fear and misunderstanding lay invisible in the courtyard, their power finally shattered by the simple act of seeing truth clearly. What had begun as a rescue mission was ending as something far more profound, the moment when an entire community learned that monsters and angels might sometimes wear the same face, and that redemption was possible even for those who had given up hope of deserving it. 3 months after the night that changed everything, the relationship between Ravenshallow Castle and the village of Thornwick had transformed into something that would have seemed impossible before truth. Replaced fear. The ancient fortress still perched on its hilltop like a guardian watching over the valley, but now its lights could be seen from the village below, warm, welcoming beacons that spoke of life and purpose rather than isolation and dread. Elenna had chosen to divide her time between both worlds, spending her mornings in the castle working on the artistic commissions that had begun arriving from neighboring villages, and her afternoons in Thornwick, helping her father and maintaining the connections that had always sustained her. The arrangement satisfied no one completely, but honored everyone's needs, creating a new kind of family that stretched across the boundaries between mortal and supernatural, past and present, fear and acceptance. Thomas visited the castle weekly now, bringing news from the village and sharing meals that had become occasions for storytelling and gentle laughter. The relationship between the two men had grown from mutual suspicion to something resembling friendship, built on their shared love for Elenna and their recognition of the sacrifices each had made in her name. Thomas no longer saw Alaric as the creature who had claimed his daughter, but as the guardian who had made her life possible and continued to protect what they both held dear. The transformation was most visible in Alaric himself. The cold beauty that had marked him for centuries had been replaced by something warmer and more human, though he retained the ageless grace that marked his supernatural nature. His interactions with the villagers, who now came to the castle seeking his help, showed a patience and gentleness that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than predatory calculation. The monster he had believed himself to be had been revealed as the guardian he had always actually been. Mrs. Hartwell had become a regular visitor, bringing supplies and news while developing an unlikely friendship with the vampire lord who had once terrified her. She delighted in teaching Alaric her recipes and learning about the castle's long history, treating him with the same maternal concern she showed to everyone who needed care and guidance. You needed someone to see past your own fears to who you really were, she told him one afternoon as they worked together in the castle's restored kitchen. Sometimes we become so lost in our pain that we forget we have the power to choose who we are each day. Father Benedict had struggled more than the others with the theological implications of their new arrangement, but eventually found peace in focusing on the fruits rather than the origins of Alaric's supernatural existence. If good works flow from your presence, he told Alaric during one of their increasingly frequent philosophical discussions, then perhaps the divine works through means that our limited understanding cannot fully grasp. The most significant change had come in the form of a document that Elenna had created through careful collaboration. With the village leaders, a new covenant that established formal relationships between the castle and the community. Unlike the old folklore that had governed their interactions through fear and avoidance, this agreement spelled out practical arrangements for mutual assistance and protection. Alaric would use his supernatural abilities to help with problems beyond mortal capabilities, tracking dangerous animals, predicting severe weather, and providing protection during times of crisis. In return, the village would offer him the acceptance and connection he had been denied for centuries, treating him as a guardian rather than a monster to be feared or avoided. The document itself was a work of art as much as law, with Elenna's carved decorations surrounding text written in her clear, precise script. The language was simple and direct, emphasizing mutual benefit and respect rather than obligation or debt. It represented a new kind of supernatural contract, one based on friendship rather than desperation, understanding rather than fear. We're creating something that has never existed before. Elenna carved during one of their evening conversations in Isabella's music room, where the restored music box played its eternal waltz while she worked on her latest artistic project. A community that includes both mortal and supernatural members, where differences are seen as strengths rather than threats. Alaric had become skilled at reading her carved messages, but more importantly, he had learned to hear the voice behind the symbols, the gentle wisdom that had drawn him back from centuries of self-imposed exile. "Your father's debt led to my daughter's birth," he replied, "but your choice to stay led to my rebirth." The scales balance in ways I never could have imagined. The castle itself reflected these changes. Rooms that had been shuttered for decades now served as workshops where Elenna created her art and taught woodcarving to village children who visited without fear. The Great Hall hosted dinners where mortal and supernatural worlds met in conversation and shared meals. Isabella's music room had become a place where memory was honored not through preservation, but through continued growth and joy. On quiet evenings, Alaric would sit beside Elenna as she worked, sometimes sharing stories of Isabella's childhood that no longer brought only pain, but also warmth and gratitude for love that had shaped him across the centuries. The portrait in the Great Hall was no longer covered but displayed proudly, showing visitors the human father who had loved so deeply that he transformed himself into something capable of protecting other families from similar loss. "She would have loved you," he said one evening as Elenna put the finishing touches on a carving that depicted the castle and village connected by a bridge of intertwined hands. Isabella always believed that love could overcome any barrier, heal any wound, bridge any distance. Elenna smiled and carved her final message of the day. Love didn't overcome anything, it revealed what was already there. You were always someone worthy of connection and care. You just needed to remember how to see yourself through eyes that weren't clouded by grief. As the music box played its gentle melody and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls, the 3 centuries of isolation that had defined Alaric's existence seemed like a half-remembered nightmare. The debt that had brought Elenna to his castle had been paid in full, but the connection they had built together would continue growing for as long as both worlds had need of the bridge they had created between fear and understanding. The monster was gone. The guardian remained. And in the space between what had been lost and what had been found, something entirely new had taken root. A love that honored the past while embracing the possibility of futures built on hope rather than regret.